I speak, because I tend to go into detail about things that I heard when I was a child, growing up at my grandmother's knee. And so this is a little bit more precise. Some people like some facts, you know. And my thing is, you know, when you grow up in the household that I grew up in, and stories were circulated, I was so hungry for the information, because you want to know, you know, where you live. You want to know the people that were connected with where you live, and you want to know all about your family. And my grandmother, my mother, who was very patient with me, would take the time to sit down and answer all my little youthful questions. And I would be asking just all kinds of things, you know, am I kin to so-and-so, or, you know, who's kin to them, and those kind of things. And they would lay out the family tree as I went about following them around doing their household chores. As I said, I'll take just excerpts of these things and kind of try to fill in details, and then there's other points of interest that I want to show you as we go through. It says from the history of Junalaska and the Boone Chapel, but some excerpts from this, it says, African Americans have lived in the mountains of North Carolina since the late 1700s. The first free blacks arrived in western North Carolina with Indian traders from Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina, Augusta, Georgia. Well, John Inscoe found that 90% of western North Carolinians held no slaves. Many residents found the system profitable, bringing slaves into the mountains of the late 1700s. By the 1850s, Inscoe noted the price of slaves in western North Carolina had risen 108%. Rather than working in plantation agriculture, most slaves in the mountains worked in varied non-agricultural endeavors, including mercantile operations, real estate, tourism, and mining. For this reason, many African Americans interviewed in Junalaska did not think of their ancestors as true slaves. When Watauga County, North Carolina, was formed in 1849, there were 3,242 whites, 29 free blacks, and 129 slaves residing in the area. The county seat of Boone began to grow while the store owned by the largest slave owner in the county, Jordan Council, was owned by Jordan Council. As the town grew, the black population began to grow as well. By 1860, slavery had decreased, and the number of free blacks had risen in the township of Boone. A black neighborhood, later called Junalaska, originated from land sharecropped and purchased by former slaves of Jordan Council. She made at that point, and to my knowledge, I have in my family history and in speaking with others, I don't know of any slave that was an ex-slave of Jordan Council that I knew of that had descendants that were still in the Junalaska community. I'm not saying that there wasn't, but to my knowledge. By 1890, the black population of Watauga County had increased to 432. By this time, Junalaska had become a close-knit community of families connected by blood and marital ties. In the late 19th century, blacks and whites shared many of the same churches, although they might worship at separate services, as they did at the Boone Methodist Church. In 1894, prominent white members of the Methodist Church decided to donate land as a location for a church for the black community. Finished in 1898, the Boone Methodist Chapel was the only black church serving Boone until 1918. Among those moving into the mountains of western North Carolina during the missionary period at the turn of the century were the Mennonite Brethren. In 1911, the Mennonite Brethren started an orphanage and school for black and white children at Elk Park, Avery County. North Carolina, forced by the local white communities to segregate their school, Mennonite leaders chose to continue their missionary work with the black population. The Mennonites began ministering to Boone black community in 1911, and in 1918 a church was constructed under supervision of white missionaries, the Reverend Joseph Setter and his wife, Catherine. Throughout the early 20th century, the Boone Methodist Chapel and the Methodist Church function as twin centers of community relations, of religion and social life in Junalaska. As an important center in Junalaska community, the Boone Chapel had many uses during its lifetime. For example, the chapel served as a black community schoolhouse in the early 20th century after a one-room school was built for black children down the road from the chapel in the 1920s. The school and chapel remained tied, often sharing leaders who served both the Sunday school teachers and school teachers. Many residents feel that Boone Chapel and the school were the two most influential centers of life in Junalaska in the early 20th century. I want to touch some on race relations in Boone. Blacks have always lived in one section of Boone, a neighborhood now called Junalaska. After emancipation, former slaves sharecropped and rented, and eventually bought and were given land on the flanks of Howard's Knob, at the base of which sits Junalaska. While sometimes characterized as essentially good by both local blacks and white race relations in Boone, Boone generally mirrored what was going on in North Carolina. And North Carolina mirrored what was going on in the South. In addition to congregated housing, churches were segregated. With construction of the Boone Chapel in 1898, the schools were segregated throughout the 20th century until consolidation and desegregation measures were taken in the late 1960s. While there had been 8 small black communities in the county, at the turn of the century, the shift of non-agricultural economy and the consolidation of black schools in Boone forced most black Appalachians to migrate into the county seat during the 1920s and 30s. I want to relate to a little bit of what was going on in North Carolina at that time, but I'll do that just a little bit later. North Carolina took a drastic turn around the 20s and 30s in its commerce. And when it happened, there were a lot of things that were affected, and it affected a lot of blacks in North Carolina. The black schools in Cold Creek were consolidated into the Boone Colored School in 1932. The black school in Beaver Dam in western Watauga County met a similar fate in 1937. Employment in the county was scarce during the Depression for blacks and whites, and many black families migrated out for jobs during that time, especially to coal mining towns in Kentucky and West Virginia. The Ku Klux Klan operated in Boone during the period prior to World War II, when racism flourished all over America. The Klan was listed as one of 3 secret orders in the 1925 telephone directory of Boone. Several prominent white townsfolk were known to be Klan members. The Klan continues to stage marches occasionally through Boone, most recently in 1993.